History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 2. The First Civilizations. Chapter 3. Ancient Egypt. So impressive is the solidarity and material richness of Egyptian civilization in retrospect, so apparently unchanging, that it is even more difficult than in the case of Mesopotamia to keep in perspective the relations with the world outside or the ebb or flow of authority within the Nile Valley. There are huge tracts of time to account for. The Old Kingdom alone, on the shortest reckoning, has a history 2.5 times as long as that of the United States. And so much happened under the Old Kingdom that often no central narrative is possible. It is hard to know what was going on and what was its importance. For nearly 1,000 years after Menes, Egypt's history can be considered in virtual isolation. It was to be looked back upon as a time of stability when pharaohs were impregnable. Yet, under the Old Kingdom, there has been detected a decentralization of authority. Provincial officers show increasing importance and independence. The pharaoh, too, still had to wear two crowns and was twice buried, once in the upper and once in lower Egypt. This division was still real. Relations with neighbors were not remarkable, though a series of expeditions was mounted against the people of Palestine towards the end of the Old Kingdom. The first intermediate period which follows saw the position reversed and Egypt was invaded rather than being the invader. No doubt, weakness and division helped Asian invaders to establish themselves in the valley of the lower Nile. There is a strange comment that the highborn are full of lamentation, but the poor are jubilant. Squalor is throughout the land. Strangers have come into Egypt. Rival dynasties appeared near modern Cairo. The grasp of Memphis flagged. The next great period of Egyptian history was the Middle Kingdom, effectively inaugurated by the powerful Amenemhet I, who reunited the kingdom from his capital at Thebes. For about a quarter millennium after 2000 BC, Egypt enjoyed a period of recovery whose repute may owe much to the impression which comes to us through the records of horrors of the intermediate period. Under the Middle Kingdom, there was a new emphasis on order and social cohesion. The divine status of the Pharaoh subtly changes. Not only is he God, but it is emphasized that he is descended from gods and will be followed by gods. The eternal order will continue unshaken after bad times have made men doubt. It is certain too that there was expansion and material growth. Great reclamation work was achieved in the marshes of Nile. Nubia, to the south between the first and third cat was conquered and its golden mines fully exploited. Egyptian settlements were found even after that further south too, in what was later to be a mysterious black African kingdom called Kush. Trade leaves more elaborate traces than ever before, and the copper mines of the Sinai were not exploited again. Theological change also followed. There was something of a consolidation of cults under the god Amon Re, which reflected political consolidation. Yet the Middle Kingdom ended in political upheaval and dynastic competition. The second intermediate period of roughly 200 years was marked by another and far more dangerous incursion of foreigners. These were the Hyksos, probably an Asian people using the military advantage of the iron fitted chariot to establish themselves in the Nile Delta as overlords to whom the Theban dynasties at the time paid tribute. Not much is known about them. Seemingly, they took over Egyptian conventions and methods and even maintained the existing bureaucrats at first. But this did not lead to assimilation. Under the 18th dynasty, the Egyptians evicted the Hyksos in a war of peoples. This was the start of the new kingdom, whose first great success was to follow up victory in the years after 1570 BC by pursuing the Hyksos into their strongholds in South Canaan. In the end, the Egyptians occupied much of Syria and Palestine. The new kingdom, in its prime, was internationally so successful and has left such rich physical memorials that it is difficult not to think that the Hyksos domination must have had a cathartic or fertilizing effect. There was, under the 18th dynasty, almost a renaissance of the arts, a transformation of military techniques by the adoption of Asiatic devices such as the chariot, and above all, a huge consolidation of royal authority. It was then that a female Hatshepsut for the first time occupied the throne in a reign notable for the expansion of Egyptian commerce. So, her mortuary temple seems to show. The next century or so brought further imperial and military glory with Hatshepsut's consort and successor, Thutmose III, carrying the limits of Egyptian empire to the Euphrates. Monuments recording the arrival of tribute and slaves and marriages with Asiatic princesses testify to an Egyptian preeminence matched by home by a new richness of decoration in the temples and the appearance of a sculpture in the round which produced busts and statues generally regarded as the peak of Egyptian artistic achievement. Foreign influences also touched Egyptian art at this time. They came from Crete. Towards the end of the New Kingdom, the evidence of multiplied foreign contacts between Egypt and other civilizations begins to show something else. The context of Egyptian power had already changed importantly. The crucial area was the Levant coast, which even Thutmose III had taken 17 years to subdue. He had to leave unconquered a huge empire ruled by the Mitanni, a people who dominated eastern Syria and northern Mesopotamia. His successors changed tact. A Mitanni princess married a pharaoh, and to protect Egyptian interests in this area, the new kingdom came to rely on the friendship of her people. Egypt was being forced out of the isolation which had long protected her. But the Mitanni people were under growing pressures from the Hittites to the north, one of the most important of the peoples whose ambitions and movements break up the world of the Near East more and more in the second half of the second millennium BC. We know a lot about the preoccupations of the New Kingdom at an early stage in this process because they are recorded in one of the earliest collections of diplomatic correspondence for the reigns of Imhotep III and IV, 1400 to 1362 BC. Under the first of these kings, Egypt reached its peak of prestige and prosperity. It was the greatest era of Thebes. Imhotep was fittingly buried there in a tomb which was the largest ever prepared for a king, though nothing of it remains but the fragments of the huge statues the Greeks later called the Colossi of Memnon, a legendary hero whom they supposed to be Ethiopian. Imhotep IV succeeded his father in 1379 BC. He attempted a religious revolution, the substitution of a monotheistic cult of the sun god Aton for the ancient religion. To mark his seriousness, he changed his name to Akhenaten and founded a new city at Amarna, 300 miles north of Thebes, where a temple with a roofless sanctuary open to the sun's rays was the center of the new religion. Although there can be no doubt of Akhenaten's seriousness of purpose and personal piety, His attempt must have been doomed from the start, given the religious conservatism of Egypt, and there may have been political motives for his persistence. Perhaps he was trying to recover power usurped by the priests of Amun-Re. Whatever the explanation, the opposition Nathan provoked by this religious revolution helped to cripple him on other fronts. Meanwhile, Hittite pressure was producing clear signs of strains in the Egyptian dependencies. Akhenaten could not save the Mitanni, who lost all their lands west of the Euphrates to the Hittites in 1372 and dissolved in civil war, which foreshadowed their kingdom's disappearance 30 years or so later. The Egyptian sphere was crumbling. There were other motives, perhaps, than religious outrage for the later exclusion of Akhenaten's name from the official list of kings. His successor bore a name which is possibly the most widely known of those from ancient Egypt. Imhotep IV had changed his own name to Akhenaten because he wished to erase the reminiscence of the cult of the old god Ammon. His successor and son-in-law changed his name from Tutankhaton to Tutankhamun to mark the restoration of the old cult of Ammon and the collapse of the attempted religious reform. It may have been gratitude for this that led to the magnificent burial in the Valley of the Kings, which was given to Tutankhamun after only a short and otherwise unremarkable reign. When he died, the new kingdom had 2 centuries of life ahead, but their atmosphere is one of only occasionally interrupted and steadily accelerating decline. Symptomatically, Tutankhamun's widow arranged to marry a Hittite prince, though he was murdered before the ceremony could take place. Later kings made efforts to recover lost ground and sometimes succeeded. The waves of conquests rolled back and forth over Palestine, and at one time, a pharaoh took a Hittite princess as bride, as his predecessors had taken princesses from other peoples. But there were yet more new enemies appearing. Even a Hittite alliance was no longer a safeguard. The Aegean was in uproar. The islands poured out their people altogether, and no land stood before them, say the Egyptian records. These sea peoples were eventually beaten off, and the struggle was hard. There followed at some time during these years an episode of huge importance for the future whose exact nature and historicity cannot be established. According to their religious texts, compiled many centuries later, a small Semitic people called by the Egyptians Hebrews left the delta and followed their leader Moses out of Egypt into the deserts of Sinai. From about 1150 BC, the signs of internal disorganization too are plentiful. One king, Ramesses III, died as a result of conspiracy in the harem. He was the last to achieve some measure of success in offsetting the swelling tide of disaster. We hear of strikes and economic troubles under his successors. There is the ominous symptom of sacrilege in the generation of looting of the royal tombs at Thebes. The pharaoh is losing his power to priests and officials, and the last of the 20th dynasty, Ramesses XI, was in effect a prisoner in his own palace. The age of Egypt's imperial power was over. So, in fact, was that of the Hittites and of other empires of the end of the second millennium. Not only Egypt's unquestioned power, but the world which was the setting of her glories was passing away. Undoubtedly, it is in changes affecting the whole ancient world that much of the explanation of the decline of Egypt must be sought. Yet it is impossible to resist the feeling that the last centuries of the New Kingdom expose weaknesses present in Egyptian civilization from the beginning. These are not easy to discern at first sight. The spectacular heritage of Egypt's monuments and a history counted not in centuries but in millennia stagger the critical sense and stifle skepticism. Yet the creative quality of Egyptian civilization seems, in the end, strangely to miscarry. Colossal resources of labor are massed under the direction of men who, by the standards of any age, must have been outstanding civil servants. And in the end, is the creation of the greatest tombstones the world has ever seen. Craftsmanship of exquisite quality is employed, and its masterpieces are grave goods. A highly literate elite, utilizing a complex and subtle language and a material of unsurpassed convenience, uses them copiously, but has no philosophical or religious idea comparable to those of Greek or Jew to give to the world. It is the difficult not to sense an ultimate sterility, a nothingness at the heart of this glittering tour de force. In other scale must be placed the sheer staying power of ancient Egyptian civilization. After all, it worked for a very long time, a spectacular fact, though it underwent at least two phases of considerable eclipse. It recovered from them, seemingly unchanged. Survival on such a scale is a great material and historical success. What remains obscure is why it should have stopped there. Egypt's military and economic power in the end made little permanent difference to the world. Her civilization was never successfully spread abroad. Perhaps this is because its survival owed much to its setting. If it was a positive success to create so rapidly institutions with which little fundamental change could last so long, this could probably have been done by any ancient civilization enjoying such a degree of immunity from intrusion. China was to show impressive continuity too. It is important also to remember once more how slow and imperceptible all social and cultural change was in the early times. Because we are used to change, we must find it difficult to sense the huge inertia possessed by any successful social system. One that is which enables men to grapple effectively with their physical and mental environment in almost any age before the most recent. In the ancient world, the sources of innovation were far fewer and far more occasional than now. The pace of history is rapid in ancient Egypt if we think of prehistoric times. It seems glacially slow if we reflect how little the daily life of Egyptians must have changed between Menes and Thothmes III, a period of more than 1500 years, and therefore comparable to that which separates us from the end of Roman Britain. Marked change could only come from sudden and overwhelming natural disaster, and the Nile was a reliable safeguard. Or invasion or conquest, and Egypt long stood at the edge of the battleground of peoples in the Near East, affected only occasionally by their comings and goings. Only very slowly could technology or economic forces exert such pressures for change as we take for granted. As for intellectual stimuli, these could hardly be strong in a society where the whole apparatus of a cultural tradition was directed to the inculcation of routine. In reflecting on the nature of Egyptian history, there is always a temptation to revert in the end to the great natural image of the Nile, always physically present to Egyptian eyes. It was so prominent, perhaps, that it could not be seen for the colossal and unique influence it was. For no context broader than its valley needed consideration. While in the background, the incomprehensible, but in the end world shaping, Wars of the Fertile Crescent rage across the centuries. The history of Old Egypt goes on for thousands of years, virtually a function of the remorseless, beneficent flooding and subsidence of the Nile. On its banks, a grateful and passive people gathers the riches it bestows. From it could be set aside what they thought necessary for the real business of living, the proper preparation for death. Chapter 4, Intruders and Invaders, the Dark Ages of the Ancient Near East. Mesopotamia and Egypt are the foundation stones of written history. For a long time, the first two great centers of civilization dominate chronology and may conveniently be dealt with more or less in isolation. But obviously, their story is not the whole story of the ancient Near East, let alone that of the ancient world. Soon after 2000 BC, the movements of other peoples were already breaking it up into new patterns. 1,000 years later, other centers of civilization were in existence elsewhere, and we are well into the historical era. Unfortunately for the historian, there is no simple and obvious unity to this story, even in the Fertile Crescent, which for a long time continued to show more creativity and dynamism than any other part of the world. There is only a muddle of changes whose beginnings lie far back in the second millennium and which go on until the first of a new succession of empires emerges in the ninth century BC. The sweeping upheavals and rearrangements which stud this confusion are hard even to map in outline, let alone to explain. Fortunately, their details do not need to be unraveled here. History was speeding up and civilization was providing men with new opportunities. Rather than submerge ourselves in the floods of events, we can more usefully try to grasp some of the change making forces at work. A complicating world. The most obvious of these forces for change continue to be great migrations. Their fundamental pattern does not change much for 1,000 years or so after 2000 BC, nor does the ethnic cast of the drama. The basic dynamic was provided by the pressures of the peoples of Indo European linguistic stocks on the Fertile Crescent from both East and the West. Their variety and numbers grow, but their names need not be remembered here, even if some of them bring us to the routine and remote origins of Greece. Meanwhile, Semitic peoples dispute with the Indo Europeans the Mesopotamian valleys. With Egypt and the mysterious peoples of the sea, they fight over Sinai, Palestine, and the Levant. Another group of northerners establishes itself in Iran, and from it will eventually come the greatest of all the empires of the ancient past, that of 6th century Persia. Still, another branch of these peoples pushes out into India. These movements must explain much of what lies behind a shifting pattern of empires and kingdoms stretching across the centuries. By the standards of modern times, some of them were quite long lived. From about 1600 BC, a people called Kassites from Caucasia ruled in Babylon for 4.5 centuries, which is a duration comparable to that of the entire history of British overseas empire. Yet by the standards of Egypt, such polities are the creatures of a moment, born today and swept away tomorrow. It would indeed be surprising if they had not proved fragile in the end, for many other new forces were also at work, which multiplied the revolutionary effects of the wanderings of peoples. One of them, which has left deep traces, is improvement in military technique. Fortification and presumably siegecraft had already reached a fairly high level in Mesopotamia by 2000 BC. Among the Indo European peoples who nibbled at the civilization these skills protected were some with recent nomadic origins. Perhaps for that reason, they were able to revolutionize warfare in the field, though they long remained unskilled in the siege craft. Their introduction of the two wheeled war chariot and the cavalryman transformed operations in open country. The soldiers of Sumer are depicted trundling about in clumsy four wheeled carts drawn by asses. Probably these were simply a means of moving generals about or getting a leader into the melee so that spear and axe could be brought to bear. The true chariot is a two wheeled fighting vehicle drawn by horses, the usual crew being two, one man driving, the other using it as a platform for missile weapons, especially the composite bow formed of strips of horn. The Kassites were probably the first people to exploit the horse in this way, and their rulers seem to have been of Indo European stock. Access to the high pastures to the north and east of the Fertile Crescent opened to them a reserve of horses in the lands of the nomads. In the river valleys, horses were at first rare, the prized possessions of kings or great leaders, and the barbarians therefore enjoyed a great military and psychological superiority. Eventually, though, chariots were used in armies of all the great kingdoms of the Near East. They were too valuable a weapon to be ignored. When the Egyptians expelled the Hyksos, they did so by, among other things, using this weapon against those who had conquered them with it. Warfare was changed by riding horses too. A cavalryman proper not only moves about in the saddle but fights from horseback. It took a long time for this art to be developed, for managing a horse and a bow or a spear at the same time is a complex matter. Horse riding came from the Iranian highlands, where it may have been practiced as early as 2000 BC. It spread through the Near East and Aegean as well, but before the end of the next millennium. Later, after 1000 BC, there appeared the armored horsemen charging home and dominating foot soldiers by sheer weight and impetus. This was the beginning of a long era in which heavy cavalry were a key weapon, though their full value could not be exploited, but centuries later, when the invention of the stirrup gave the rider real control of his horse. During the second millennium BC, chariots came to have parts made of iron. Soon they had hooped wheels. The military advantages of this metal are obvious, and it is not surprising to find its uses spreading rapidly through the Near East and far beyond, in spite of attempts by those who had iron to restrict it. At first, these were the Hittites. After their decline, iron working spread rapidly, not only because it was a more effective metal for making arms, but because iron ore, though scarce, was more plentiful than copper or tin. It was a great stimulus to economic as well as military change. In agriculture, iron using peoples could till heavy soils which had remained impervious to wood or flint. But there was no rapid general transfer to the new metal. Iron supplemented bronze, as bronze and copper had supplemented stone and flint in the human toolkit, and did so in some places more rapidly than others. Already in the 11th century BC, iron was used for weaponry in Cyprus. Some have argued that steel was produced there too, and from that island, iron spread to the Aegean soon after 1000 BC. That date can serve as a rough division between the Bronze and Iron Ages, but is no more than a helpful prop to memory. Though iron implements became more plentiful after it, Parts of what we may call the civilized world went on living in the Bronze Age culture. Together with the Neolithic elsewhere, the Bronze Age lives on well into the first millennium BC, fading away only slowly, like the smile on the face of the Cheshire Cat. For a long time, after all, there was very little iron to go around.